In the winter of 1987, in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, 15 members of the same family sat down for what they believed would be a celebration. By midnight, none of them would leave that house alive. What began as a Thanksgiving reunion ended as the deadliest family massacre in Appalachian history. And the reason behind it all was a piece of land that had been in the Grayson name for over 100 years. The Grayson family had lived in Harlan County since before the Civil War. They were coal people, mountain people, the kind of folks who measured wealth not in money, but in land, in timber, in the mineral rights buried deep beneath the hills their ancestors had cleared with their own hands. For generations, the family had survived poverty, mining disasters, and the slow death of the coal industry. But they had always stayed together. They had always protected what was theirs. By the 1980s, the family had splintered into 3 branches. The eldest branch, led by patriarch Elmer Grayson, controlled the original homestead and the 53 acres of forested ridgeline that came with it. The second branch belonged to Elmer's younger brother, Harold, who had moved to the valley and opened a small auto repair shop. The third branch was led by the youngest sibling, a sister named Dorothea, who had married a man from out of state and rarely visited anymore. Elmer had 2 sons. The older one was named Calvin, and he was 41 years old at the time of the tragedy. Calvin was a quiet man, thick-bodied, with hands rough from decades of manual labor. He had worked in the mines until a collapse injured his back in 1979. After that, he lived on disability checks and odd jobs, spending most of his time caring for his aging father and maintaining the family property. Calvin was not an ambitious man. He wanted nothing more than to live out his days on the land where he was born, to be buried next to his mother in the small cemetery behind the old church. The younger son was named Darrell, and he was the opposite of his brother in almost every way. Darrell was sharp, restless, and resentful. He had left Harlan County at 18, moved to Lexington, and tried to make something of himself in the city. But the city had not been kind to him. He had failed at 2 marriages, lost money in bad business deals, and returned home at 38 with nothing but a truck full of clothes and a deep, burning sense of humiliation. When Darrell came back to Harlan County, he expected to be welcomed. Instead, he found that his older brother had become the unofficial heir to everything their father owned. Calvin made the decisions. Calvin managed the property. Calvin sat at the head of the table during family meals, and Darrell, despite being the smarter and more worldly of the two, was treated like a guest in his own family home. The tension between the brothers had been building for years, but it reached a breaking point in the fall of 1987 when their father Elmer suffered a stroke. The old man survived, but he was left unable to speak or care for himself. He could no longer manage his affairs. He could no longer clarify his wishes. And most importantly, he could no longer update the will he had written 15 years earlier. That will was the source of everything that followed. According to the document, Elmer had divided his estate between his 2 sons and his sister Dorothea. Calvin was to receive the homestead and the majority of the land. Darrell was to receive a smaller parcel on the eastern edge of the property, along with a modest sum of cash. Dorothea was to receive a token inheritance and the rights to the family cemetery. But in 1985, Elmer had verbally promised Darrell that he would change the will. He had told his younger son that the original document was unfair, that Calvin had already received years of free room and board while Darrell struggled in the city, and that things would be made right. Elmer had even visited a lawyer in town to discuss the changes, but the stroke came before any new will could be signed. Darrell believed he had been cheated. He believed Calvin had manipulated their father, had convinced him to delay the revision, had deliberately run out the clock until it was too late. Whether this was true or not, no one would ever know, but Darrell was certain of it, and that certainty poisoned everything. In the weeks before Thanksgiving, the family began gathering from across the region. Harold and his wife came from the valley. Dorothea flew in from Ohio with her husband and 2 adult children. Cousins arrived from Virginia and Tennessee. In total, 17 people would be staying at or near the Grayson homestead for the holiday weekend. Calvin had organized the reunion. He saw it as a chance to bring the family together, to show that despite their father's illness, the Graysons were still strong, still united. He spent days preparing the old house, cleaning rooms that had not been used in years, stocking the pantry, cutting firewood for the massive stone hearth in the main room. Darrell saw the gathering differently. He saw it as an opportunity. In the days before the family arrived, Darrell began visiting his relatives one by one. He spoke to Uncle Harold about the unfairness of the will. He told Dorothea that Calvin had poisoned their father against the rest of the family. He whispered to cousins that the land was worth far more than anyone realized, that a mining company had recently expressed interest in the mineral rights, and that Calvin was planning to sell everything and keep the profits for himself. None of this was true. But Darrell told the lies with such conviction, such wounded sincerity, that several family members began to believe him. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, the family was divided into factions. Some supported Calvin, some supported Darrell, and some simply wanted to survive the weekend without a confrontation. The dinner itself was tense but uneventful. 17 people crowded around tables that had been pushed together in the main room of the old farmhouse. The food was traditional: turkey, ham, cornbread, beans, pies made from recipes that had been passed down for generations. The conversation was careful, polite, full of the kind of small talk people use when they are trying to avoid larger truths. But after the meal, when the dishes had been cleared and the children had been sent to bed, the adults gathered in the main room to discuss the future of the family estate. It was Darrell who raised the subject. He stood by the fireplace, his face lit by the flames, and he asked Calvin directly, when their father passed, what would happen to the land? Would Calvin honor the promise Elmer had made? Would he share the inheritance fairly, or would he take everything and leave his brother with nothing? Calvin's response was measured. He said he intended to follow their father's written will. He said verbal promises made in private could not override a legal document. He said he loved his brother, but he would not be guilt-tripped into giving away what their father had clearly intended for him to have. The argument escalated quickly. Voices rose. Old grievances surfaced. Uncle Harold tried to mediate, but he was shouted down. Dorothea began to cry. Cousins took sides. Within an hour, the reunion had become a battlefield. It was nearly midnight when the first act of violence occurred. Darrell, drunk and enraged, shoved Calvin against the stone fireplace. Calvin struck his head on the mantel and fell to the floor, dazed but conscious. Harold stepped between the brothers, trying to separate them. And in that moment, something inside Darrell snapped. He reached for the iron poker beside the fireplace. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If stories of real human darkness and the terrible price of family secrets keep you watching until the end, then this is exactly the kind of content we create. Subscribe now so you never miss what happens next. What happened in the next 3 hours would become the subject of criminal investigations, psychiatric evaluations, and local legend for decades to come. The details emerged slowly, pieced together from the testimony of the 2 survivors who managed to escape into the frozen woods. Darrell struck his Uncle Harold first. The blow caught the older man across the temple, and he collapsed without a sound. For a moment, the room was silent. 17 people stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Then Darrell turned toward his brother Calvin, who was still on the floor, still dazed from hitting his head. But before Darrell could strike again, something unexpected happened. His cousin Vernon, Harold's eldest son, grabbed a chair and swung it at Darrell's back. The blow staggered him but did not stop him. Darrell spun around, his eyes wild, and drove the poker into Vernon's chest. The room erupted into chaos. People screamed. Some ran for the doors. Others tried to wrestle the weapon away from Darrell. In the confusion, Calvin managed to crawl toward the kitchen, where he retrieved a hunting knife from a drawer near the sink. When he returned to the main room, his brother was standing over the body of their Aunt Dorothea's husband, a man named Richard, who had tried to reason with Darrell and paid for it with his life. Calvin did not hesitate. He crossed the room and plunged the knife into his brother's shoulder. But Darrell did not fall. He turned, blood streaming down his arm, and the two brothers faced each other for the first time as enemies. The rest of the family scattered. Some locked themselves in bedrooms. Others fled into the night, running barefoot through the snow toward the nearest neighbor more than 2 miles away. What followed was not a single act of violence, but a prolonged nightmare that lasted until dawn. Calvin and Darrell fought throughout the house, each trying to end the other, each failing. In their struggle, they knocked over lanterns and candles, starting small fires that filled the rooms with smoke. They crashed through doors, shattered windows, and left trails of destruction in every room. But the brothers were not the only ones responsible for the deaths that night. As the chaos spread, other family members began to turn on each other. Old grudges, long buried, exploded in the darkness. Cousins who had been arguing for years finally acted on their hatred. A nephew who had been cheated in a business deal years earlier took his revenge. A wife who had been humiliated by her sister-in-law struck back with a piece of broken glass. The Grayson family did not merely witness a tragedy that night. They became the tragedy. By the time the first police car arrived, called by a neighbor who had seen one of the survivors stumbling down the mountain road, the farmhouse was silent. 15 people lay scattered throughout the property. Some had fallen inside the house. Others had been pursued into the barn, the woodshed, the frozen fields behind the property. The youngest victim was 19 years old. The oldest was 73. Calvin Grayson was found in the kitchen, slumped against the refrigerator, still breathing but barely conscious. He had multiple wounds across his body and had lost a dangerous amount of fluids. Darrell was discovered in the cellar, where he had apparently retreated after the final confrontation with his brother. He was alive but unresponsive, his eyes open but seeing nothing. The two survivors who had escaped into the woods were Calvin's daughter, a young woman named Melissa, and her cousin Thomas, Dorothea's son. They had hidden in an abandoned hunting blind nearly a mile from the house, listening to the distant sounds of violence until exhaustion finally pulled them into unconsciousness. When they woke, the sun was rising, and the nightmare was over. The investigation that followed was the largest in Harlan County history. State police, FBI consultants, and forensic specialists spent weeks reconstructing the events of that night. They interviewed Melissa and Thomas dozens of times, trying to understand how a family gathering had transformed into a scene of such complete devastation. The answers they found were both simple and impossibly complex. The simple answer was that Darrell Grayson had initiated the violence. His attack on Uncle Harold had been the spark that ignited everything that followed. Without that first blow, the other deaths might never have occurred, but the complex answer was that the violence had been building for generations. The Grayson family had never learned to resolve their conflicts. They had suppressed their anger, buried their grievances, and allowed resentments to fester until they became toxic. The inheritance dispute was not the cause of the massacre. It was merely the excuse. The true cause was a family culture that valued pride over communication, that treated vulnerability as weakness, and that passed down trauma from one generation to the next like a genetic disease. The prosecutors faced a difficult question. Who should be charged with what? Darrell was clearly responsible for multiple deaths, but Calvin had also killed at least 2 people during the melee, and several other family members had committed acts of lethal violence against each other. In the end, the district attorney decided to charge both brothers with multiple counts of the most serious offenses, while pursuing lesser charges against 2 cousins who had survived and were implicated in specific deaths. The trial of the Grayson brothers became a media sensation. Journalists from across the country descended on Harlan County, drawn by the gothic horror of the story. A Thanksgiving massacre, a cursed inheritance, brothers who had destroyed their own bloodline over a piece of mountain land. The courtroom was packed every day. The testimony was harrowing. Melissa Grayson, Calvin's daughter, was the prosecution's star witness. She described hiding under a bed while her father and uncle fought in the hallway outside. She described hearing the screams of her aunts and cousins, the crash of furniture, the smell of smoke. She described crawling out a window and running into the darkness, not knowing if anyone else had survived. When she finished her testimony, half the courtroom was in tears. If you are feeling what Melissa felt in that moment, the terror, the grief, the desperate need to survive, then type in the comments right now. Family should protect, not destroy. Let me know if this story is touching something deep inside you. The defense attorneys tried to argue that both brothers had acted in self-defense, that the situation had spiraled beyond anyone's control, that the other family members bore equal responsibility for the deaths. But the jury was not convinced. After 3 weeks of testimony and 4 days of deliberation, they returned their verdict. Darrell Grayson was found guilty on 11 counts and sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison without the possibility of release. Calvin Grayson was found guilty on 3 counts and sentenced to 35 years. The 2 cousins who had been charged received sentences of 15 and 20 years, respectively. The Grayson homestead was seized by the county after the trial. No one in the family wanted it anymore. The land that had caused so much suffering was eventually sold to a timber company, which clear-cut the ridgeline and left the property barren. The old farmhouse was demolished. The family cemetery, where generations of Graysons had been buried, was relocated to a public plot in town. Within 5 years of the massacre, the Grayson name had effectively disappeared from Harlan County. Melissa changed her surname and moved to California, where she started a new life far from the mountains that had defined her family. For over a century, Thomas, her cousin, returned to Ohio and never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed. But the story did not end with the convictions. In the years that followed, psychologists and criminologists studied the Grayson case as an example of how family dysfunction can escalate to catastrophic levels. They identified patterns that were disturbingly common: the suppression of honest communication, the accumulation of unresolved grievances, the toxic competition for parental approval, the way that material disputes can become proxies for deeper emotional wounds. One researcher who spent years studying the case wrote that the Grayson massacre was not an anomaly, but an extreme manifestation of dynamics that exist in many families. The difference, she argued, was simply that most families never reach the breaking point. Most families find ways to release the pressure before it becomes explosive. The Graysons had no such release valve. They had been building toward that. Night for generations. Darrell Grayson died in prison in 2009, having never expressed remorse for what he had done. In his final interview, conducted by a documentary filmmaker who had been tracking the case for years, he said only that he had been cheated, that his father had promised him something and his brother had stolen it, and that everything that happened was Calvin's fault for refusing to share. Calvin Grayson was released from prison in 2019, having served 32 years of his sentence. He was 73 years old, the same age his father had been when he suffered the stroke that started everything. Calvan returned to Harlan County briefly, but he found nothing waiting for him there. The land was gone. The family was gone. Everyone who had known him either hated him or feared him. He moved to a small town in West Virginia, where he lived alone in a rented trailer until his death in 2023. According to the woman who found his body, he had not spoken to another human being in weeks. There were no photographs on his walls, no letters in his drawers, no evidence that he had ever belonged to anyone or anything. The Grayson family had ceased to exist, not because they had been struck by disaster or misfortune, but because they had destroyed themselves. They had taken their inheritance, their legacy, their blood ties, and they had turned all of it into ash. And for what? For 53 acres of mountain land that no one would ever live on again. For mineral rights that were never actually worth anything. For a will that could have been rewritten in an afternoon if anyone had been willing to have an honest conversation. The people of Harlan County still talk about the Grayson massacre. They tell the story to their children as a warning. They point to the empty ridgeline where the farmhouse once stood, and they say, "That is what happens when family becomes enemy. That is what happens when pride matters more than love. That is what happens when people forget that blood is supposed to connect, not divide. The Appalachian Feast of the Dead, they call it now, a thanksgiving that became a funeral, a celebration that became a grave. And somewhere in those mountains, if you listen closely on cold November nights, the old-timers say you can still hear the echoes of that terrible evening. Not the screams, not the violence, but something worse. The silence of a family that had everything and threw it all away because they could not find the words to forgive each other. If you watched until here, it is because you felt something. It is because this story reached a part of you that understands how fragile families really are. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can know who truly connects with the stories on this channel." And if this video made you think about your own family, about the grudges you might be holding, about the conversations you have been avoiding, then do something about it. Not tomorrow. Today. Because the Graysons thought they had time too. They thought there would always be another chance to make things right. There was not. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the moment. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this one. Leave a like if this video moved you. And share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone who might be one conversation away from healing a broken relationship. Because in the end, that is what the Grayson story teaches us. It is not about land or money or inheritance. It is about what we choose to value. It is about whether we let our pride win or our love win. It is about remembering before it is too late that family is the only inheritance that truly matters. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching until the end. And thank you for being part of this community that believes stories like this one can change lives. Until the next one.